Hey guys, Mr. King here. Today we are going to talk about the relationships among living things, and we've been talking about how the different organisms in an ecosystem interact. And sometimes you have living organisms interacting with other living organisms. Sometimes you have living organisms interacting with a non-living organism, like a frog sitting on a rock. And then in other cases you have two non-living factors interacting with one another, like the sun shining on the water and causing it to evaporate. And all those different relationships make it so an ecosystem can function. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about the groups of organisms and how they interact with each other in order to make an ecosystem successful. So first off, living things are organized into these different groups to make it easier to study the ecosystems. Now, if I was an ecologist and I went into the forest and I said I'm going to study every single animal in the forest, that would be impossible. So you pick a very small group of animals and you study them. And you can see at the top, the most general order is called the kingdom. And if you place the animals into a kingdom, they're sorted by the common characteristic that they're all animals. That's why it's Animalia. And then if you want to get a little more specific, you can place them into a phylum. And you can see that's Chordata. And Chordata means they've got a nerve cord. So you can see the one that's missing from the kingdom Animalia, if you move down to Chordata, is the sea star. Sea stars don't have a backbone or a nerve cord, so they get removed. So you can see it gets a little more specific each time. If you go from phylum to class, then you go to Mammalia, and you can see the coral snake's gone, because a coral snake is not a mammal. It doesn't have hair on its body. And so each level you move down, it gets a little more specific until you get down to the species, which is just that animal itself. So in order to classify things, ecologists put them into groups because it makes more sense than saying, I'm going to study everything on Earth. That would be almost impossible. Now, a lot of them have common characteristics, but as you sort them down, you can get to the more specific family or genus or species. So a population is a group of the same type of organisms living in the same place at the same time. So for example, we have a little bit of a woodsy area behind the middle school, a little forest. We could say a population is a group of squirrels living in the forest behind the middle school at 3 p.m. And that's the number of squirrels that are in that forest at a given period of time, and that's called a population. Now, all the populations that live in an area make up a community. So if we talk about the other types of organisms that live in the woods behind the middle school, we might talk about the population of birds that are in the forest, and we might talk about the population of trees. And if we combine all those different populations, if we take the squirrels, the birds, and the trees, that makes a community. And a community is the interactions between the populations. So here's a little video. It's kind of cheesy, but it shows it well. It explains it, and it's pretty basic, but I think it really helps to solidify what the difference is.
Ecology, the study of the interaction between living and non-living things. Ecology all begins with an organism, which is a living thing. The example we're going to see is of the fox. So an organism can be represented by one single fox. A fox is a living thing. But is an organism the sun? No, the sun is non-living and is not an organism. So to recap, an organism is one living thing. But if I wanted to make an organism fit the definition of a population, I'd have to change a few things. I'd have to add more foxes to this picture because a population is a group of the same organisms. So a population would be a group of foxes all living together. But would one single rabbit be a population? No, a rabbit by itself is an organism. A group of rabbits would be a population. So to recap, a population is a group of the same organisms living together. But if I wanted to make a population a community, we'd have to change a few things. In a community, you still have the population of foxes, but you also have other populations that the fox might come across. A population of rabbits, a population of snakes, even a population of birds. And don't forget, plants are living things too. A population of trees also help to define a community. A community is many populations. So a community includes all the populations in an area. But would a fish tank be an example of a community? No, a fish tank includes living and non-living things. A community has all living things. So to recap, a community is of many populations living together. But if I wanted to make a community into an ecosystem, we'd have to add a few things. An ecosystem includes everything in a community and the non-living things, like sunlight, cloud, rocks, mountains, and temperature. An ecosystem is living and... So let's review. An ecosystem includes all the living and non-living things in an area. Would water be an ecosystem? No, water is just one non-living thing. Now, sometimes in an ecosystem, organisms compete or fight for survival. In this ecosystem, the fox could versus the snake when they fight for rabbits. Another example of competition could be the big tree versus a small plant as they fight for sunlight. And all of this is taking place in ecosystems around you.
Alright, so that gives you a little bit of an idea about community and population and ecosystem. The big difference between a community and an ecosystem is ecosystem involves non-living factors. So ecologists sometimes want to know the size of a population, where its members live, and how it's able to stay alive. And to do that, they have to go into the environment of the organism and do a lot of counting and a lot of estimating. And once they figure out how many of the organisms are in an area, they can determine the population density. And population density is determined by comparing the size of the population with its area. In other words, are there a lot of different organisms in a given space? So if you guys are all sitting in Miss Goulette's room, she has a smaller room than I do, and so she has a pretty high population density because there's a lot of you and there's not a whole lot of open space. On the other hand, if you go to my room, it's a big open space and the population density would be pretty low because there's a lot of empty space to roam around. Now, if you're going hunting, you want to find an area that has a high population density. In other words, there's a lot of the organism in a given area. If it has a low population density, it would be kind of hard to find them. So if you look on the map here, this shows the population density of our world, and you can see the most populated country in the world is India. And India is really dark on the map, and because that's got the highest number of people per square kilometer. And you can see that's almost 3,000 people per square kilometer. Now if you look at the US, you can see our East Coast has a lot more people on it than the West Coast. And if you look in kind of the middle states, there's not a whole lot of population there because there's not a lot of big cities. There's a lot of open area and not a lot of people. So if the ecologists want to go a step further and track how populations move, they use tags to study populations of animals that travel long distances. They might shoot like a tranquilizer dart into an animal and then plant a tag in them, or if it's something small like this butterfly example that you're going to see, they can just catch them with their hands and place a tag on them. But this allows ecologists to track and see how the population moves, and it also allows them to see how they stay surviving and the number of organisms in the population. So check out this video about the butterflies here.
So this is a male monarch butterfly, and it's been tagged with a tag from Monarch Watch, which is an organization out of the University of Kansas. It's a citizen science program that people can order these tags, and they either go out and they capture monarch butterflies, or, in our case, if you're rearing and releasing them, you affix a tag to their wing.
And they used to do this at Hollywood Elementary in the garden. If any of you guys are from Hollywood,
and
they used
then
to
running through their
a lot of
entire
monarch
migration,
butterflies,
which in Northwest Ohio usually lasts through the early part of October. Say this butterfly makes it to New Mexico, and it dies, it gets hit by a truck or something of the sort. Somebody finds this tag, and there's a phone number that they can call and report the number of the tag, so that gives scientists a little snapshot of where this butterfly originated from and where it ended up. And so that helps tell scientists a lot more about these insects' migration. And the more data they can gather on it, the better, and we can figure out why and how they're making it to Mexico. And a lot of people ask, does that hurt the butterfly? Does it affect?
So it's not going to affect the butterfly. It's not going to have any impact on it. It might slow its wing speed down a little bit, but overall, it'll be fine. So things that could stop the growth of a population. If there's nothing that's stopping the growth, it'll go on and on forever. And so we've got things that cause populations to have their organisms die. And those things are called limiting factors. For any organism, examples of limiting factors are food, water, living space, other resources. If we talk about humans, our limiting factors, cars are a limiting factor because we get in car accidents, planes crash, guns and weapons take a lot of lives. And all of these things limit the size of a population. Now, if we're talking about animals in nature, the big one is food and water and living space, and they have to compete for that, and they have to try to find different ways to outcompete the other organisms, or they'll not survive. So the competition, the greater the number of organisms in an area, the greater the competition is going to become. So if you live in a forest by yourself, life is good. You don't have a whole lot of people to compete. But if you're in a heavily populated area with a high population density, there's a lot of limiting factors. There's a lot of different predators who are trying to eat you, and there's a lot of other consumers around you who are trying to eat the same thing as you, so there's a limited supply. But all these things balance out in order to make an ecosystem work. And if we didn't have limiting factors, if we didn't have things dying out, all the ecosystems would overpopulate, and that would cause a tremendous amount of problems. If you have uncontrolled growth, plants would overtake because they could grow out and animals wouldn't eat them. If you had consumers with no limiting factors, nothing would ever eat each other. And if you had decomposers with no limiting factors, they would decompose everything in sight, and we wouldn't have a lot of the different plants and animals that we would have. All right, guys, I hope you guys all have a wonderful night. Write some good questions. Don't forget the quiz, and I will see you all tomorrow.